Alrighty, so this is the object that we will use as a reference, and what we then want to have in the end, just to have it in the recording, is something that looks like this one here. Let's see how that goes. I will start by starting with a new scene, and I guess the basic shape kind of resembles a cube, so I will start with a cube. Did I have the original files on there? No. How did you already have it open?
It's done.
I left the Cinema 4D file on there?
That's fine, now we can work with it.
For not in hours.
Oh no, I didn't want that. Aww.
Yeah, we don't know.
Anyway.
It is gonna
Damn it.
airdrop it to us.
Alrighty, so I start with the cube, and right now I will do something that is a little bit new and different to how we usually work. So take a look. I will convert this into polygons. Then I will go to my polygon mode, and I will select everything, and I use the move tool to move it upwards. What this results in, if I go back to my model mode, that the anchor point or the axis stays on the floor. Because I switched to the polygon mode, which means I'm now changing the polygons themselves. I'm not moving the base of the object. So the anchor point stays at the bottom, but I still move my element up. This way I can later on easily see where something should be aligned perfectly with the floor. I will go back to my polygon mode, and I start adjusting this a little bit to kind of the height that I want. I can always adjust things later on. Then I will need some sort of stand. So here I can see I couldn't make it out that well, so I just built something to make it look more interesting in the bottom. For that, I extrude it downwards. When I'm already in the move tool and I only have one polygon selected, it's quite simple. I just hold down the control key and I click and drag to create an extrusion. Then I click and drag to create another extrusion. The second one should be placed exactly to the floor. And now, when I change the Y position to 0, it goes exactly to the floor because the anchor point of the object is precisely where the floor is. Then I can create a loop selection to select this split that I've created here. The loop selection has the shortcut U for lots of selection things, and then L. Then I hover over the correct edge to select it. I can then adjust it in the position, adjust it in the size. So I want it to be something like this. Then I want it to go inwards. For this, I D for the extrude tool. By default, if I extrude it outwards, it creates something like this. And if I extrude it inwards, it creates something like this. So obviously, I need to tell it that it should preserve the groups. But when I take a look at the options of the tool, I can see it is already preserving the groups. However, there's always this angle that it checks between elements to see if something is belonging to a group. And here, the angle is 90 degrees. But the maximum angle here is 89 degrees. So here we need to increase this value for this to detect it properly. So let me undo this step and do it again with 91 degrees. And if I now extrude it towards the inside, I can see how I just make it thinner and therefore add this little detail at the bottom. Then I want to create this inner part here. So apparently I need another square to be placed in here. I can't just draw a square in here, that does not work. So I have to prepare my polygons and then I can add an inner extrude. What I want to do is, I want to create a loop cut. When I hit K, I open up the options for the knife tool. For some reason they renamed it, and now instead of calling it the knife tool, we have 3 different tools that are called cut. But K you can remember as knife. The one that I want to use is called loop or path cut. The shortcut is L. Then I hover over an edge and I click, and it creates a cut going all the way around. Then I can go to my move tool, and now I have a polygon here where I can do the inner extrude. I hit I for the inner extrude, and I click and drag. Like so. Then I want this to be pushed back. I hold down the Control key and I drag this to the back to give this some depth. All right. This top part was the easy part. Next, I want to bevel the edges. So when I take a look here, I can see, or maybe I zoom in a bit, I can see how there's a bevel going all the way around here, and there's a bevel in the extrusion or intrusion there. To do so, I can actually use a tool or a deformer that is called bevel. Like with every other deformer, I have to apply it to the element by parenting it to it. And immediately I can see how it creates some additional edges here. If I go to the bevel and I increase the distance, I can see that this is almost doing what I want, but it's beveling all the edges. I somehow need to constrain it to certain edges that I care about. So I disable the bevel deformer for now. I go back to my cube. Then I go to my edge mode, and with the move tool, I click and then shift click on all the edges that I want to have. For the inner part here, I can actually use a double click and it detects how it should go around. For the outside, when I double click, it does it kind of, but down here it would select things that I don't want to be beveled. So for the outside ones, I have to do it quite manually to create the selection. Then I want the selection to be saved so I can access it through the bevel deformer. To do so, I go to select and I will say set selection down here. Now we already know a similar icon that is used when we save polygon selections to apply materials to specific polygons. When we have edges, then we can see it looks quite different. In the bevel deformer, I can then take this, drag it down, and drop it into the selection field. This field does not link directly to the selection. It just gets the name. So this one knows it should be applied to any selection that is called edge selection. Because I know I will need a second one later on, I might already rename the selection. So here we can already see it is applying the way that I would expect it to. I get the bevel only on the selected polygons. But if I select the selection tag and I change it, maybe I'll call this one outer, I can see that it doesn't work anymore because the bevel deformer still remembers it should be applied to edge selection and not outer. I can either drag in the selection again, or I can just type it in myself, outer, and I can see now it is applied again. Alright, so this works quite fine. Now the bottom part, this one here, is a little bit more tricky. When I do this, I have to plan it out a bit. So I can see I have a couple of cuts that I will need, some horizontal cuts. I have 1 cut, 2 cuts, 3 cuts, 4 cuts. So I at least need 4 cuts to be able to have the polygons that I need to extrude towards the inside. I already know that I will also need 2 more cuts at the top and the bottom, otherwise the bevel deformer does not work. So I need 6 horizontal cuts overall. Then I will need 1 cut here, 1 cut there, and 1 cut there. So 6 horizontal cuts and 3 vertical cuts give me the option to do the inner extrude in this design. Let me go back to Cinema and I will disable the bevel deformer for now. I go back to my cube and I make sure that nothing is selected because it could be irritating. I hit Command Shift A to deselect everything. Command A selects everything. Command Shift A deselects everything. I go back to my knife options and I hit L for the loop cut. I will create 2 cuts that will define the top and the bottom. Then I click anywhere on the inside between the two, and then I use the plus icon here. And then I can add evenly the other cuts that I need. So now I have 6 cuts overall, and this is all I need. Are they 6? They are 6. Next, I want to create some cuts along here. Here, it now becomes important how I modeled this, because this needs to be the front of the element. Because I want to go to my front, and in the front, I want to create the cuts that I need. So, let me go here, and oh, by the way, to know what the front is always facing away from the z-axis. So we can see here we have the z-axis, it points away from the object or in the other direction. And now we know this is the front. So in here, I take the knife tool again, but this time I will use the regular line cut. So I hit K. This one works quite different. I click, then it creates this point. Then I move the cursor down. I can hold on the Shift key to make it constrain. And then I hit the mouse again. And then it shows me where it created these cuts. I could then just create more cuts, but I just think it's weird to create another line like this, and I'm afraid that the tool might not work the way I wanted to. So I finish this cut by hitting escape. Then I can do it again. The second cut, somewhere like here, holding down Shift, clicking it, and escape to finish with the tool. And then the last one, kind of in the center. Now I have all the cuts that I need. I can go back to my perspective view, and I can use my move tool to select the polygons that I want to do the inner extrude for. I can either use the extrude tool and extrude it backwards, or I can use the move tool and hold down the control or command key to move it backwards. The end result is precisely the same. Then I want another selection for this edge around here. I go to my edge mode and I double click on one of the edges, and I can see for the longer edges it does work, but the other ones apparently don't understand how they are connected to one another. So the rest I have to do manually. So this looks fine. And now I want to create an additional selection. I have this one already here, and I have to be careful. If I have this selection selected, and I go to select, and I choose set selection, it will overwrite this selection. So when I want to create a new one, it needs to be deselected, like this. Then I have my edge selection here. I can go to select and set selection, and I get a second one. Maybe I'll call this one inner. Then I can just create another bevel deformer, drop it inside, and restrict it to the second selection. Now it almost does what I want. I get an edge here that I don't like, and to fix it, I go to the metering option and I change this to uniform. And now I get the look that I want. Maybe I make it a little bit thicker, like this. Alrighty. Then I can enable the other bevel tool, which does a bigger bevel, and my model is pretty much finished. And this is what we will now do together.
I just want the files and then get the airdrop. Thank you.
Whose is that? Siemens, are your computers good?
Did you move?
It's back. Does it work?
All right. Then let's do these steps now together. You don't need the files right now. We do it pretty freestyle. So for this example today, there are hardly ever any specific values that I tell you to use. You just follow along, and if it looks good, it looks good. If it doesn't look too good, then it doesn't look too good. If you open up the file that is ready, I will notice. So if I come around and then I see the finished product, I will know that it's... Okay, we start with a blank project. In here, we want to start with a cube. The cube should be converted into polygons. That's the first step we do. The shortcut is C, or you can use the icon in the top left corner here. Then we want to move it up, but we don't want to move up the element itself, including the anchor point. We want to move up the polygons. So we switch to the polygon mode. We hit Command A to select the polygons, and then we can use the move tool to move it up. make sure that you only move it up along the y-axis. Otherwise, the element is not centered anymore. So after you moved it, your coordinates down here should say 0, something, 0. If this says anything else, then you did it wrong.
Wait. Yeah, I'm doing it wrong.
When you move it, really make sure that you hover over the axis that you want to move along. So I want to move it along the y-axis. It needs to be highlighted. And then I can move it along constraint. Next, we want this to be overall a little bit higher. So we select the top polygon and just drag it a little bit up. Only the top. Then we select the floating just a little bit. As I said, no correct values today. Then we select the bottom and we want to extrude it 2 times, and we will use the shortcut. You are still in the move tool and you have the polygons tool selected. You hold down the command or control key, you hover over the z-axis and you drag it once, twice.
Why?
Just just like floating around this space takes me a little bit more time. Modeling by itself is fine. Wait till see.
So you just need to extrude it down twice. That's all.
Shocking was you, right?
No. Just holding down the control key and dragging it down. Control or command.
Why are we doing it? Two times.
The bottom one,
Should be larger.
no, it should just be all the way at the bottom. The bottom polygon that we still have selected should be at the y position 0. So we go to our coordinates down here and we change the y position to 0. 0.
Everything is 0?
Everything is 0.
But it just extended my thing.
Did you hold down the command or the control key while you were dragging?
Yes.
Did you select under?
Let's continue. We want to create these additional cuts in the top here, or one additional cut, so we can create the intrusion properly. To do so, we will switch to the knife tool. You hit K, then you get a quick list of all the other shortcuts you can now hit. And we want to use the L shortcut for the loop cut. We hit L. Then we hover over this edge here, and we want to create another cut. So we create something that is kind of a square. So in the top, we want something that is kind of like a square, like this. Then we want to create the polygon that sits in the front. Now I explained a little bit earlier how we can figure out where the front of the element is. When you take a look at the axis at the bottom, the one on the floor here, we can see how the the z-axis is pointing this direction, which means my element is pointing the other direction. So this here is the polygon that is in the front where I want the display to be. Then, with that polygon selected, we hit I for the inner extrude. Then we click and drag, preferably in an empty area, to do the inner extrusion like this.
We are doing it here, no?
We're doing together.
What did I do? Oh no, I changed it.
Then we want to do the extrude towards the inside to get the actual TV screen. We hit E to go back to our move tool. Then we hover over the Z-axis, which is the blue one. You hold down either the command or the control key, and you click and drag the Z-axis backwards. Okay? We have it selected. We hover over the Z-axis. Make sure you're in the Move tool. Hold down the Control key,
Too much.
and then you click and drag it backwards. Okay?
Yeah.
Then we also want to create kind of like an extrude on this ring at the bottom that we created earlier. We first need to select it. The quickest way of selecting it is using the loop selection. You can find the tool by going to Select and using the loop selection here, or you can also see the shortcut here, U and then L. With the loop selection, it selects based on the mode that we have selected here, either points, edges, or polygons. We hover over the polygons that we want to select, and you need to go to the edge that should be used to detect which direction it should go. When you click it, we should have it something like a yellow belt. Then we switch to the Extrude tool. You hit D for the Extrude. You make sure that the Preserve Groups option is turned on, and the maximum angle should be higher than 90. The precise value doesn't matter as long as it's higher than 90. I usually just click 2 times to go from 89 to 91, and then we should be good. When we then, anywhere in an empty area, click and drag to the left, we should see how it does this extrude towards the inside, like so.
Oh, but mine is
Just a little bit. I can show you in a moment how you can adjust it easily. So far, so good.
Yes.
I will take a little X course and I will show you something, how you can fix the geometry now if you are unhappy with the proportions. Take a look. Don't do stuff on your screen or your phone. I will show it first, and afterwards we will briefly do it together, but it's kind of optional. So if I now realize, well, maybe the positioning and the size of this is not good. I want this to be thinner. The best way of doing this is actually selecting the points and moving the points around. Because I know everything is aligned perfectly along the y-axis, I can just select all the points that somehow belong together and move them around at the same time. For that, I can go to my front view here. Then I switch to the point mode, and I will use the rectangle selection tool. In it, I double check that I have the only select visible elements option turned off, so it selects all the points going all the way through the object. So I can select all these points, I can move them down, I can also scale them to make them thinner. If I'm unhappy with the proportions that I have here, I can also select these points and move this one down to change how the screen looks. So I can also see it live in here. As I change something, it changes there as well. So don't try to select polygons or scale them if you're not really sure that you do want to scale them. Always think about the geometry and where you want certain proportions to remain. For instance, I want this distance here to remain the way it is. It just looks cleaner. So I make sure that I select these 2 points and these points down here as well.
Yeah, so if we were to use the loop tool and then like select the polygons of that one side and then scale them, what would happen?
If we, for instance, want to make this thicker, we not only have to use the loop selection for the ones in the center, because if I change them, they're changing only on the inside here.
No, I meant the
So-
one above that.
This one.
Yeah.
If I do just these ones and I scale it, for instance, then this happens. So here, I would definitely need to select, I could still do it with polygon selections, but I would need to select these ones, and these ones. And now I have enough polygons selected, so I could also scale it and move it. But since this is a little bit tedious, I would usually suggest switching to the front mode and then selecting the points in here, because selecting polygons here, especially if they are facing myself, it's pretty hard to do. So it makes sense to just think about where there are points and where I want them to move to get to the shape that I intend. All right? So let's do it together. For the people that are unhappy with their proportions, we switch to the front view In the front view, we want to switch to the point mode on the left side here. Then we use the rectangle selection tool. Just like any other panel in Cinema 4D, you can click and drag to choose additional tools here. And with this one, we can then click and drag across the points that we want to select. And we are then able to move them and scale them to our liking. Next, we want to create these 6 cuts up here. I will, yes?
We did the bevel, you did the bevel first.
Okay, then we do the bevel first. We go back to the perspective view, and we will do the selection for the bevel of the outer edges that we already have. We switch to the edge mode, then we select the move tool, and then we can start with the selection of this ring here. You can just double click on one of the edges, and you can see that Cinema detects how you want them to be selected. There are certain mathematical orders that Cinema uses to select rings. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work the way you want to. If I hold down Shift, I can add to this selection. If you then double click on this edge, we can see how it selects the top, but it doesn't go along the bottom here. So to select the rest of the bottom, we Shift click every single one. If you accidentally select one that you did not want to select, you hold down the Control or Command key and click on the edge again to deselect it. So Shift adds to the selection and Command or Control subtract from the selection. Alrighty?
You shouldn't choose the inner one, right?
Don't choose this one here. That one should remain sharp. So just the ones in the front.
What about the edges connecting?
No, just these ones here that are yellow right now should be selected.
Oh no.
Then we want to save this selection. So we go to Select, and we choose Set Selection. We can now see how I created a selection tag up here.
One more time.
Select, and at the bottom, Set Selection. And you should then see how you have an outlined triangle as a tag up here. We already know that we need 2 tags, and unfortunately, Cinema 4D sometimes doesn't give them different names. So when we know we need more, we should already start giving them proper names so we can distinguish them. With the tag selected, we go to the Attributes panel and we change the name, and we call this one Outer. Then we create a bevel deformer. The bevel deformer is underneath the bend deformer, and it's all the way in the bottom left corner, all on its own. It's kind of sad. Then we take the bevel deformer and we drag it into the cube. And we should see how our object gets beveled all the way around, but this is not what we're looking for. So with the bevel deformer still selected, we see the selection option down here. And we drag the selection tag in one smooth motion into the selection field. Now the bevel deformer should only be restricted to that selection. If the dragging and dropping for some reason is too tricky for you, you can also type in the name in here manually. So in the selection, you can also manually type in Outer. And as long as you type it precisely the way you typed it before, you should be good, and it should be restricted to that selection. Then, with the bevel deformer still active, we can go to the offset and increase it until we have a nice, strong bevel, something like this.
But yours have edges. Yours gonna have those edges like smooth. Mine's like
Why do you think they're smooth edges? These are hard edges.
Yeah, like mine, maybe it's smaller.
Let's continue. Now that this bevel looks nice, we want to disable it so it doesn't interfere with the new cuts that we are creating. So let's turn. Exactly. So let's turn the bevel off by turning the checkbox into an X.
But then what's the difference between doing that and the red lights?
The red lights mean something should not be visible.
Yes.
The checkbox means it should not be generating something. So if I turn off the bevel, this means that if it was a deformer, so for instance, if I have the bend deformer, I can see the bend deformer. And the bend deformer does something to the object, as we can see here. If I turn the bend deformer off like this, I just don't see the bend deformer anymore, but it's still generating the effect. On the other hand, we have this one, and this means I still see it, but it's not generating something anymore. So the bevel deformer should be disabled. Then we want to go to the front view. In here we want to create the 6 cuts. I will explain verbally right now what we will do, then we will do it.
Together.
We create one cut that defines the top of the new things that we need and one cut that defines the bottom. Then we create a third cut somewhere in the middle. We can then use the interface to split this cut into multiple more cuts that are distributed evenly across the section that we defined with the first 2 cuts. So let's do this together. We select the cube. We make sure that I would prefer to be in the polygon mode when we do this. I would also prefer that nothing is selected. So you want to command Shift A to deselect everything. Then we go to our loop cut. K and L is the shortcut. You should see how the cursor has changed to something that already looks like a loop cut. Then we create a cut kind of like here and a second cut kind of like here. We can always scale it later on if we are unhappy with it. Then we create a third cut in between these 2 cuts. Then we have to be careful. We created this cut, and then we want to use the plus up here to add more cuts evenly on the same edge. And we want to create 4 cuts overall. Or 4 new cuts.
Yeah.
4 cuts?
4 cuts, or add 3 cuts. In the end, we want 6 new lines.
Yeah, it didn't.
Next, we need to create our vertical cuts. We don't want to do it with this tool, because that way we would create a cut going all the way around the element, and then things might get messy. So we hit K and K again to go to the regular knife tool or the line cut. That's a K too much. Then we click somewhere, like here on the top line. It creates the first point. Then we move the mouse down. You can hold down Shift and it constrains, and then you click. It still wants to continue creating a cut, but we don't want it to, so we hit Escape. And then the cut is applied. Then we can do it a second time. Click on the top line, hold down Shift, move down, click on the bottom one. We hit Escape.
Skate?
And then you do it.
Now I'm not getting the knife.
KK.
Then we want to go back to our perspective view. In the perspective view, we then switch to the Move tool, and we can select this shape within our polygons.
Why is my knife tool so?
You need to switch the
switch to the move tool, like I just said.
Wait, I'm missing one.
Well, we can choose whichever ones we want.
Well, there's not so much room where you could select something different.
Done.
Okay. Don't use the trackpad. Use 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, he's using it as well.
Okay. It's still fucked up?
Yeah, sometimes.
Then we want to duplicate the polygons backwards or extrude them backwards. We hold down the Command or Control key, we hover over the Z-axis, and we click and drag to push it backwards. And then we should have something like this.
See, that's one.
How come you didn't do extrude?
Alrighty, next we want to create our edge selection to create another bevel deformer there. We use the edge mode and the move tool, and we shift click on all these edges here.
Only the outer, right?
Only the outer ones.
No.
Then we want to save the selection. Before we do that, we double check that our selection tag is not selected anymore. And it isn't, so we should be good. We go like earlier to select, and we choose set selection. We then have a second selection tag, which we also want to rename. So with it selected, we go to the name, and we change this one maybe to inner. Then we create a new bevel. Inner. Then we create a new bevel, and we drag it inside of the cube. Make sure that you don't drag it into the other bevel, so we don't want a child of a child. We just want both bevels on the same hierarchy level. To distinguish them, we already know the new one is checked. So this one we rename and call inner, and the other we call outer, just so that we know which one is which. On the... Yeah? What is the issue?
Yeah. It's like they're not related, but we have them.
Then, on the inner bevel, we want to apply the inner selection tag. You can either use the drag and drop again, or you can type in inner manually. And you should then see how this one is restricted to just the selection. All right. We want these edges here, however, to look a little bit different. And we do that with a metering. Or mitering, I don't know. I think it's called metering, but it's written, I don't know. We scroll down a little bit in the bevel options, and further down we find the metering. Mitering? Metering?
It doesn't meet you.
It doesn't meter.
Hate that phrase. The happy of a wordplay that was. The happiest place.
We change it from default to uniform, and then our edges should look like this. Then we can make it maybe a little bit thicker. So I would change my offset maybe to 2 centimeters. And I think it's just perfect. The offset, the same thing that we changed earlier.
Two.
It Depending on your size, you might want to use different values. Then we can enable the outer one again as well. And then we should have our basic shape of the TV ready. No.
Finish it? Yeah, that's
All right. Next, we want to apply some colors to it. I will do it first. Afterwards, we do it together. So this is a pretty simple procedure. In the files that you've got today, you should have a link, this color wheel, color scheme, blah, blah, blah. So on most computers, you should just be able to open it up. But the link is also in the RTF file. So I will copy this one. I don't know. No, I don't. Can I just say no?
Oh, did you make this? Did you make this?
But I copy it already. No. I don't make stuff. Oh no, I did not copy what I wanted. How did K-pop happen? I get CrossFit and K-pop. Maybe we could do both. No, I don't want. Why is there an X but I can't click it? Just okay. Let's try this again. There we go. So I have the color scheme here, and I want to create 3 colors: the yellow, the orange, and the dark blue. As I said, I just do it first, you watch, and then we do it together. I take the hex code of the color and I copy it. I go back to Cinema and I double click to create a new material. Since I want to go for this low poly look and I want it to be looking like an illustration, I will not use reflectance today. We only work with color, just medium. And I paste the hex code in here. Then I duplicate the material, go to the next color, copy it, and paste. And then a third time, getting the next color and pasting it. Then I want to apply it. As we know, whenever we want to apply something to a specific selection, we have to do it later. We start with the base color. So the base color is this yellow. Then I want the dark blue to be applied to the screen and to the slot. I go back to my polygon mode, select the cube, and I use the move tool to select the polygons that I want this applied to. These ones here are already selected, so that's good. I hold down the shift key to also select the top one. Then I drag the material either on one of the top or the bottom selected polygons. And then I can see how it is applied like this. Then I will create a floor and I will use the orange material on the floor. We will not have a sky today. It will just be a floor. No sky. After I've applied these materials, I could hit Command R, but I will notice that I don't see anything because I don't have any lights.
Yes.
So let me show you what the next steps are so you can see how quickly this look happens, or the first steps are happening. In the render settings, we have the physical renderer. There are too many eyes looking downwards. The physical renderer is based on usually things that are physically happening. There are some additional things that are not that physical that it still supports, but when we want to go for a toon shader, the physical renderer does not give us the option. So I will switch from the physical to the standard renderer. I can see that the physical options have disappeared down here. Then I can click on the effect button and I can see that there's an effect that is called sketch and toon. When I choose it, it gets added to my list here. For this example, I don't want global illumination, so I turn this option off. If I now hit render, I can see that this happens. And it renders very, very quickly. So what the sketch and toon does is, it takes the default light, because we don't have any GI enabled, it will use the default lights that we also see here. So you can see, from this angle, it's bright here, darker there, so when I render, Same thing, brighter here, darker there. If I move my camera around, and now this one is brighter than that one, still exactly the same colors. So if I don't create my own lights, it will use the default lights of my setup. Then, alright, let's just get to this point here together. We start by opening up the link. When it's open, we should see this nice color wheel. We want to start with a yellow color. We select it, and we copy the hex code. Back in Cinema, we double-click to create a new material. We open it up, and we turn the reflectance off. Then we paste the hex code, and we should have our yellow material. Then we duplicate it by either holding down Command or Control and dragging it to the side. By default, the duplicated material is selected. We can then copy the next color, which should be the brighter orange, and we paste it into the hex field. We then repeat the same process for the dark blue color again. We apply the base color, which is the yellow, to the cube. Then we need to create a selection. So we select the cube, switch to the polygon selection. Probably the polygons down here are still selected. If they aren't, make sure that they are. Because we have a yellow material on it, it's a bit harder to see, but we can see how the polygons are not outlined in blue anymore, but they are outlined in orange. Then, with the Move tool, you can hold down Shift and also select the polygon in the top here, this one. Then we drag the dark blue material onto one of the selections. Doesn't matter which one. And then we should see, when we deselect the cube, how it is applied like so. So far, so good. Then we want to have a floor.
Did you switch your view from display from
If you speak more silent, I don't hear you at all anymore.
Did you switch your display from shading lines to shading? Why can't
You could switch this if you want to, but it's not necessary. I have it just on the default, which is growth shading.
no, as in how come your lines are not visible?
Because I deselected the object. While it's selected, and when I'm in the point mode or the polygon mode, I see the lines. But if it's not selected anymore, the lines are gone. Then we create a floor, and we apply the orange material to the floor.
The orange floor.
A floor, and we apply the orange material to the floor. All right?
What's your orange massive?
It depends on the angle. See, when I look from here, it looks pretty dark. When I look more from the top, it looks brighter. Then we go to our render settings. By default, our renderer is the physical renderer. So we go up here and we choose standard. Then we already know that we don't want global illumination, so we just uncheck it. Then we go to the Effect button, scroll down through the list, and we can see a little bit further down there's the Sketch and Tune. It should be added to the list like so. And that should be it. When we now render, we should get something like this. Yes. Okay.
A render setting effects. And I wanted to ask you something. Whenever we want to render like fine, is in a position where you don't have to switch it yourself. You know what I mean? Like to give the final render, like to get it as an image.
Well, you can always create a camera. We've done it in the past. We will also do it today. And it will always use that camera that is active when you start the rendering. Did that answer the question? Kind of.
Because every time it's hard to kind of get like a nice perspective on the thing that was created.
Mm-hmm. That's why we usually create a camera, so we have the option to change the focal length to get a different look in the perspective. And with this camera, it's also easier to say, I want to render it like this, for instance. You can then go outside of the camera, do stuff, change the model, and then you can go back to the camera and you have exactly the same view that you could render again. We will use it later today as well. All right, let me give you just a quick explanation of what the difference between the standard renderer and the physical renderer are. There are three more. These ones only use the graphics card in a way that they render exactly what we see in the editor. So we hardly ever need these two. Then there's the Pro renderer, which is pretty new, which works with the GPU of your graphics card. And it is kind of cool, but it's not there yet, so I don't want to talk about it. It's complex, but it's not good enough. Also, it doesn't make sense to use the Pro renderer on our MacBooks, because on the MacBooks, the CPU is stronger than the GPU. So it would not make sense to use a GPU-based renderer if the other ones would be faster anyways. The standard renderer, in many cases, renders a little bit quicker than the physical renderer at first. But with the standard renderer, we run into a lot of issues. The physical renderer works with something, you don't care. Essentially, it just shoots lots of things onto the scene, and for each point, it can calculate what should happen. And then it adds more and more points, and that's why the image over time gets better. We get this first quick preview where it only shoots a couple of points, then more and more points. And then it does the fine rendering where it shoots hundreds of points in just that bucket and calculates it. That is why we can get very quick results that are a little bit noisy, but when we increase our samples, we get less noisy results and it looks nicer. The physical renderer works a little bit different. The standard renderer works a little bit different. That one renders different parts. It would render first, okay, how does the image look if just the image is applied? Then it uses the lights to multiply the shadow areas on top. Then it would use other things like GI, which it puts it on top. Then we have reflection, which puts it on top. So it has all these different layers that are being calculated. For each of these layers, we can define ourselves how the quality of it should be. There's not one slider where we can say, make it better. But there are many different areas where we need to troubleshoot if something does not look good. For instance, textures by default look very crappy. They look pixelated. Shadows look like shit. And all the things look pretty shit in the standard renderer if you look close to it. If we then change the standard renderer in all these different places to look good, it renders pretty much the same amount that the physical would. So that is why I personally use the physical renderer the most. Also, everyone else in the business does, because it's just, with a quick preview, it's nicer. The standard renderer, for instance, does not support a quick preview. It always renders from the center, and it doesn't give us a blurry preview, and then it starts the rendering. However, a couple of things in Cinema 4D are not adapted to the physical renderer yet, or it doesn't make sense. For instance, with the hair, we noticed that when we do the hair rendering, in the standard, it was done in like 5 seconds. But the physical renderer took like 5 minutes. So some modules work a little bit faster in the standard renderer, but the look is quite different. Sketch and Tune only is available in the standard renderer, and we will need to troubleshoot a couple of things. The first thing that we want to troubleshoot, however, has nothing to do with the renderer itself. But when I render, I will notice some edges are not visible, like this one here, or also there. I should see an edge here, and I should see an edge back here. So the bottom edge is quite simple. Because my object sits precisely on the floor, the edge is intersecting with the floor. But the floor does not create an edge. And that is why it's kind of cut off. I think This should not be something that we need to worry about, but apparently it is. So here we would have to fake it a little bit. Let me save this so I can revert to it in a moment. I would just take the floor and I move it down just slightly. Just -1. Oh, sorry. If I do this and nothing is happening, the reason is that I did not move the floor. And I didn't move it because I was in the polygon mode. A floor does not have polygons. It's an infinite object that we cannot touch. So when I try to move the polygons, it says, nah. So I need to go to the model mode, and when I then change this to -1, I can see now it remembers it. Now it did do the change. If I now render, I can see how the edge at the bottom is now clean like the other edges as well. Now, these edges that are missing here, yours might be in different areas. I'm not quite sure why this is enabled, but for some reason, the material that creates the edges filters some edges. I open up the material that the Sketch and Toon shader created, and with this one I have lots of different options for how the material behaves and how the stroke behaves. Today we keep it super simple. We don't touch it at all, except for in the strokes option, we turn off the filter strokes. So for some reason, if strokes are too short, they will be filtered and not shown at all. If I turn this option off, just me. If I turn this option off, I can see that now I get strokes all the way around the object without any issues. Then there's one more thing. If I have this and I render it, it looks a certain way. The lines are pretty thick in comparison to the object. If I, however, render this to the picture viewer, I can see that these lines look different. They're a lot thinner in relationship to the object. So by default, a line is always created based on the size of our viewport, and it always has a specific thickness. So by default, I think it has like 2 pixels in the stroke. So my viewport is smaller than the final render. In the viewport, the line, therefore, in relation, looks thicker. To fix this, I would need to do that in the Sketch and Toon, in the render settings, and here the option is called Resolution Independent, which means now it takes the base resolution from the render settings. If I now render this, I can see how these lines look a lot thinner because my viewport is smaller. But they will now have the same look sort of as I see here. So if I take this and I scale this down to about 50%, I start to see that the lines are now the same thickness. Then I want to fix the background here. So the background right now is a lot brighter, or it's white essentially. To fix it, I will first need to get the color of the background. I copy it, I go to the render settings, and in the Sketch and Toon, I can define in the shading which color it should use. By default, apparently it uses a white color, but here I can give it the same orange color that my floor has. But now I can see this is still not the same color because of my camera angle. But I might want to use a camera angle like this at some point, but it's still not the way that I want it to be. Let me first add some lights and see if this might fix the issue. I will start with an infinite light. I will hit R for the rotation. I rotate it around. I do want to see shadows, so my infinite light needs to create shadows. This is the very only time where I ever use a ray traced shadow, because I do want it to be this comic-y, sharp-edged shadow. So I choose the ray traced hard, and in my options, I will enable shadows as well. So here, I can now define the angle of the light that I want. Already I can see how now the floor has a constant color. It does not change anymore based on my view, because the default lights have been turned off, and now it uses the lights that I've chosen. Now another thing that will only do for this project, or projects like this, and never ever else. I create another light, and I don't give it a shadow. Usually this is a big no-no. But in this case, when we work with a comic style, I don't want shadows to be black. I might want some light to fill it up. So I go to the light options. Under General, I scroll down, and there's a checkbox that is called Ambient Illumination. This means that the light will just fill up my screen with light coming from everywhere. It doesn't have a direction, a position, a size, nothing. It just lights up everything, and therefore it lifts my shadows. It does get a little bit too intense though, so I change the intensity down to 50. So now this already looks a lot nicer to look at. If I now render this, I can see how it renders quite quickly, but the shadow looks like shit. And this is where the perks or disadvantages of the standard renderer come in. We have to now figure out what the issue is, why the shadows look like this. In the physical, we just say, well, there are samples missing, let's add more samples. Fixes the issue. Here, we have to know what the issue is, and the issue is the anti-aliasing. So I would need to go to the render settings and manually go to the anti-aliasing and change it from geometry to best. Then, when I render it, I can see it takes maybe a little bit longer. We will see later how much longer it takes. But now the shadow looks smooth in the way I want it to. If I change the camera angle though, and I render, I can see, well, the color is close, but it's not precisely the same. We've had this issue once in the past. Do you remember how we fixed it? No. No, in Cinema 4D. I will give you a hint. We use the compositing tag. So apparently my floor does not do what it should do. So I choose the floor, I right click on it, go to Cinema 4D tags, and I choose the compositing tag. Then, on the compositing tag, which option is the one that I need to enable or disable? What did you say? Compositing background, exactly. So this will make sure that the floor merges smoothly with the background. So when I now render it, I have a perfect transition. Beautiful. All right, let's get to this point together. We start by creating a light source. Oh no, we still need to fix the edges, sorry. We go to the Sketch and Toon material in the bottom left corner. We open it up. We go to the strokes, and we turn off the filter strokes option. When we then render, we should see how we get lines all the way around. We might still have an issue with the floor, so we select the floor. Make sure that you switch to the model mode. And then we can type in -1. And when we then render, we should get all the edges nice and clean. Then we already know that our strokes will not have the correct thickness in comparison to the final render. So we go to the render settings, to the Sketch and Toon, to the renderer, and we enable the resolution independent option. Then we go to the shading, and here we find the option for the background color. We can just open up our material, copy the color, and paste it into the hex code field. When we then render from an angle where we definitely see the background, we should then see how the background has the correct color. Our floor does not, but we will fix it later. Hmm? The floor is what?
I have an application now
Next, we want to create our light setup. For that, we will create an infinite light. We click and hold on the light, and we choose the infinite light. The infinite light should create a shadow. So we scroll down, and we change the shadow from none to ray traced hard. To see the shadows in the preview here, we go to Options and choose Shadows.
Options. What do you say? Options.
Options and Shadows. You might not see the shadow just yet, but when you have the light selected and you go to the rotation tool, you can then click and drag in an empty area but within the rotation tool to rotate it around, and you should then see how we get a nice shadow.
Which adds doesn't matter.
Just click, take a look closely here. You see this ball,
Yeah.
and you want to click on the ball, but you don't want to click on any color. Nothing should be highlighted. Just click in an empty area, and then it's like touching it with the finger and moving it around. And therefore, you're rotating the infinite light and change from where the light should come. All right. Next, we want to create the light that fills in our shadows so that they are not black. For that, we create a new light. This time, it will be just a point light. We just create a normal point light. Then, we scroll down and we choose the ambient illumination option. Now our scene should look kind of overexposed. To fix the overexposure, we will go to the intensity of this light and change it to 50. Then, when we hit Command R to render, we can see how our shadows are super hard.
Yeah, not nice.
Not nice. So, we will go to the render settings, into the anti-aliasing, and we change the anti-aliasing from geometry to best. When you then render it again, the shadows should look a lot nicer. Render settings, anti-aliasing, and you change it from geometry to best. Then, lastly, we want to fix the transition between the background and the sky. So we right-click on the floor, go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the compositing tag. On the compositing tag, we want to enable the compositing background option. When you then render, you should have a perfect transition between the background and the floor. That did not sound good.
Yeah, still get the. I didn't change the color.
All right. Then I would say we take a short break, 10 minutes. So at 10 Minuten, at 15:22, I want you all to be back.
22.
Alrighty. I want to show you how we can create a light setup that is a little bit more interesting. Right now, if I render this, it looks too 2D for my taste. I mean, we are in a 3D program, so we should take advantage of the options that we have here. What I want to show you is a function that is called ambient occlusion. Let me show you a generic scene where I can show you what ambient occlusion does. If I have a material that is just on the luminance, I can apply it to my cube and everything. So right now I can hardly see anything. Also, when I render it, I see pretty much nothing because everything is just white. But I can go to my render settings, I can go to Effect, and I can choose Ambient Occlusion. What this one does is, it creates something that looks like shadows, but essentially it just calculates the distance and the angle of polygons to one another. The closer polygons are together, the more a shadow or the darker an area will become. When I then render this, I get this look. So we can see wherever there are polygons that don't belong together or where we have an edge, we get the shadow, and here we also get a shadow where the sphere is closer to the element. Maybe I move the sphere up a little bit, then we can see it a bit better. Come on. Like this. Then we can really see how this casts a shadow against it. Like this. We have different options for the ambient occlusion. If I go to my render settings, I could, for instance, say that it should have different colors. As soon as I experiment with the colors, I can understand a little bit better what's happening. Let me enable the interactive render region here, so it just constantly updates the rendering. Not in the best quality, but at least I see something. I can change the black color to, for instance, blue. And then I can see how the shadow becomes blue. If I change the white color to something like yellow, I can see how everything else becomes yellow. So essentially, this just creates a gradient. The further something is apart, it will be yellow, and the closer something is together, it will be blue. Then we have the maximum ray length, which defines what is the largest distance that it looks at. And here it's set to 100 centimeters. If I increase this value to, for instance, 400, I can see how this spreads a lot farther away and creates this really nice, almost like a dirt kind of effect. And this we can create and combine with our 2D sketch and tune. So let me close this, go into the scene, I go to the render settings, I click on the effect, and I choose the ambient occlusion. I already know that this needs to be a little bit larger, so I will change my maximum ray length to 300 and the minimum ray length to 100. This will just make it a lot stronger. If I now render this, I can see how, well, something is happening. I can see that on the floor, I do get the shadowing, which is nice, but it's not applied to my element just yet. The reason is that this material, or the sketch and tune, does not allow it. It always wants this sort of posterized effect on our elements. To fix this, I need to go to the render settings, to the sketch and tune, and then in the shading, I need to turn the object shading off. This way, it will use the regular colors that the renderer creates, and then it only puts the lines on top. So when I now render this, I can see how I get these nice gradients and this 3D feeling of the element, plus my edges on top. Let's add this together. Yeah. Hmm? In our render settings, we want to click on the Effect button. And we want to choose, at the very top of the list, the ambient occlusion. In the ambient occlusion, we want to change our minimum ray length to 100 and the maximum ray length to 300. When we now render this, we should see how we get this nice 3D gradation on it. But we notice that the ambient occlusion looks kind of shitty. It is pretty noisy. So we are used to this noise with working with the physical renderer. And for the physical renderer, we can usually say just add more samples and we're good. Here we have to do it too, but we have to do it specifically for the ambient occlusion. So in the settings of the ambient occlusion, we can see how we have minimum samples and maximum samples. I would recommend using minimum samples of 50 and maximum samples of 150. When we then render this, it does take a little bit longer, and we can now see how how the standard renderer works. Because it renders only from the center towards the outside, and we don't get a quick preview. But now our shadows or the ambient occlusion is nice and smooth, and we can hardly see it. We just feel that it's there, but we don't see it as clearly because it's smooth. So far, so good? All right. Now, to save a little bit of time, I will show you how I modeled the keyboard and the mouse, but we will not do it together, because I also want to focus about how we want to do the rendering for Photoshop in these two different ways, the making of and the final rendering here. So now, the next 10 minutes, you don't watch anything else but that TV. Or myself. That's fine too. But watching the TV is a little bit more helpful. Let me start. I want to create the keyboard here. So probably I will start again with a cube. I take the cube and I move it towards the front. I scale it into the size that I want it to have. So something along these lines. I want to convert this into polygons, so I hit C. I look at it from the bottom, and I take the bottom polygon and I move it precisely to the floor. Then I want this to be a little bit angled, so I take my edge mode, select the edge, and I want to move it up. I want to move it up precisely, so what do? Right now, I move it away. How can I make sure that I move it up?
You can change the values in the...
No, I could change these values, but what is more interactive?
Isn't it the thing up in the corner with the cube and the
Button next to
that one?
That one, exactly. This one now takes a look at the world coordinates, and now I can move it based on the world and not based on its own thing. And then I have this nice angle. Now for the keyboard, I will not rebuild it precisely. I just want it to look like a keyboard and feel like it. So I will start with a cube and a cloner, because apparently I have cubical shapes that are somewhat regularly aligned. Then I will use a special mode, which is called honeycomb. What honeycomb does, it offsets each line by 50% of the first one. If I zoom out and I drop the cube into this, I can see this is the pattern that it creates. I can then adjust the size width and the size height until they sit on top of each other quite nicely. Then back in here, I can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows or columns, one of the two. So I say that my height should be 5. I can then take the entire cloner, I can move it roughly into place, scale it roughly into the size, and I also rotate it roughly. Then I will go to my side view, I position it, I scale it, and I rotate it until it feels like, yeah, this could be, might be. This looks about right, maybe, oops, sorry, a little bit smaller, and go back to the regular axis to move it a bit up. And then I just increase the count for the width until I have my keyboard. Then it needs to be a little bit irregular. To do so, I want to create a copy of this. I right-click on the cloner and I will say current state to object. This creates a copy of it where I have each cube as its own object. So I can disable the original cloner, but still everything is here, with the difference that I can select every single key and move it around. So I want obviously these two keys to be a little bit wider, so I select both of them. When I switch to the model mode, I'm able to access the polygons of both selected, and I can move it to the side until I have the width that I need. I could also select one of the other ones, take a look at the X position based on the world, and figure out what the precise position would be, but no. I don't think that anyone cares, so I really just select them and move them until it looks like it's okay. Then I can just delete the ones that I don't want, so these I don't need. And then I have here the space bar. It's a very long space bar, but it works. Done. And now I have my keyboard. Then I apply the same materials here, not to each cube separately, but to the cloner group itself. So it's applied to everything, and then this one to the cube in the bottom, and I have my keyboard. For the mouse, pretty similar. I create a new cube, I move it into place, I scale it down, in the model mode, fixing, and something like this. Converting it into polygons, going to the bottom, selecting the bottom one, and I move it up. Then, what I will do here is, I deselect everything and I use the loop cut. I create one cut here, and then I create a second one. Now they are precisely centered. I can then use the loop selection to select these two, and I can scale these polygons to the side. Then I can use again the loop cut to create a cut like here. Then I can select this polygon and this one, and I can do an inner extrude. Here I can see it breaks, so I need to do the same change. Maximum angle, 91, preserve groups. So when I now do an inner extrude, it does like this. Then I can select, again with the loop selection, this outer ring, and I can do an extrude towards the inside, like this. Then I can select the polygons here, and I can grow the selection. I hit U and Y, which grows the selection until I have all the insides selected. I apply the black material and the white material, or the bright material, but the bright material should be applied first. And then I have my mouse. For the connection to the PC, or the Mac, the cable, I will go to the top view, I will go to the pen tool, and I will choose the B-spline. For the B-spline, I just click to create points, and it creates a rounding itself. So I try to make this look a little bit natural. And I create a second one. I deselect the spline, and I start from here. Maybe this one got crazy. Oh, why did it stop there? Undo, 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 undo. Chip, 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 chip. Chip, 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 chip. 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 Alrighty. Then, when I go back here, I want to create some geometry onto this. How can I make this into geometry?
In the net recently.
But the area is correct. Sweep. It's the sweep. But I need more. So I have these two that they need to be connected first, so they act as one. But I need something else. If I drop this into the sweep, nothing is happening. What else do I need? I will give you a hint. 1 second. 1 second. Maybe 2 seconds.
To change the mode.
What do we see?
Snake.
Exactly. We see the line, and we've created this line. But there's another one. This one here. It needs to know what it should use to sweep along the path. So we need a circle. So I will go to the pen, click and hold, and I choose the circle. I drop the circle inside as well, And now the circle will be used, and it looks super pretty. Obviously, it's way too large. So I go back to my model mode and I use the scale tool. With the circle selected, I scale the circle down. And then I get my line here. To make it overall a little bit prettier, I will choose one of the splines. I will select one of the points. It's easiest to select them while I'm in the point mode, and I look at it from the top here, for instance. Then after I selected a point, I can just move this one up a little bit. Then I can select the next point, move this one up as well. So this way it now comes out of the mouse, and we can see how it is off the floor, then it reaches the floor. I can then also select a couple of more points. So maybe point over here, oops. Maybe some points here and there, and definitely here, and here, and there. And I can just take all of these points and move them up a little bit. Where can I see my axis? Over here. Just move all of them up a bit. So now I get this more natural feeling. So it's not lying flat on the floor. Because if it's flat on the floor perfectly, then it's not nice. I would do the same thing for the back one, but I'm too lazy to do that now. Then I want to make sure that nothing is intersecting with the floor. So I can see how it is intersecting with the floor a little bit, and I don't want that to happen. So I will go to my right view. I will select the sweep overall, and I know that this line here, somewhere, this line here is my floor. So I make sure that these ones are not, are not intersecting with the floor, and now everything is lying perfectly on the floor. Alrighty. So now this could be my final rendering. I will show you the steps that we want to do for the final rendering first. Afterwards, we do them together. I go to my render settings, and I want to go to the output. I double check 1920 by 1080, it's fine, and I only render the current frame, so just one frame, not a sequence. I go to my save options, and I just give this a name. As you might remember, when I just type in a name, it will be saved directly where my Cinema 4D file is. I saved the Cinema 4D file on my desktop, so this file will be saved there too. So let's call this one Mac render. Oops. I want to render this with 16-bit. I don't need an alpha channel, so I turn it off. I really want to make sure that I get the background color if it's visible. Then I want to choose a camera angle. And I feel like the camera here distorts a little bit too much. I want it to look a bit more, a little bit tinier. So I create a new camera, I look through it, and I change the focal length to a portrait lens. And now we can see how this feels different and doesn't distort as much anymore. Then I look for the angle that I like, something like this. I do a test render. Everything seems to look fine. So now I can hit the render to picture viewer button. Now this will render in the picture viewer in the correct size, and as soon as it's done, it will save the file to my desktop. So let me just minimize everything that we don't need here. I still have some renderings from yesterday. Let me get rid of those. And by the way, the only thing that takes so long to render is the ambient occlusion. The rest usually renders within a second, but the AO does take some time to calculate. Now that it's done, I can see how I have my finished rendered file on my desktop. Okay, let's do this together. No, we will leave them out. Yes. We go to the render settings. We don't have time for that. We only have 45 minutes left.
Yeah, what is ours?
Enough.
No.
So we go,
Ask you about
sure. We go to the output, and we double check that our settings here are correct. So the output should be 1920 by 1080, and our frame rate should be 25 and the current frame. So usually these things are fine. Then we go to the save option. Make sure PNG 16-bit. We don't want it to create an alpha channel, so we turn it off. And we give it a name. So I call this one just Mac Render. Then we take a look at our scene and we might realize that it distorts a little bit too much. So we create a new camera. We look through the camera by activating this icon. And then we change the focal length from classic to portrait. We might then need to zoom out a little bit, and we should see how it feels different. We can feel that we have a different focal length. We can then look for an angle that we like and do a quick test render to see if this creates what we're looking for. Yeah. Next, we want to actually render this out. Make sure that you have your file saved somewhere. If this says untitled, then you probably did not save it. So save it on your desktop or anywhere. And then you can use the render to picture viewer button. As a reminder, if the file is not saved, then it doesn't exist. So when Cinema 4D tries to save the rendered file, it does not know where to save it because the Cinema 4D file doesn't exist anywhere. So this shouldn't take too long, only a couple of seconds. Let me show you how we can create the second rendering. For this, we will also use the standard renderer, but a different functionality. Here's something that is new to you and also a little bit complicated. So take a look up to the screen here, and I will show you something. I can go into the render settings, and I can add new render settings. I could take the ones that I already have. I can right-click on them, say copy, just me. Then I right-click on it, and I say paste. Now here's where it is a little bit complicated. We see the same icon that we know from the camera. So one at a time can be active. This means it will use the active render setting. So when it's white, these are the settings that Cinema will use. However, if I change something, so in my render settings, maybe I call these ones making off. I could say I don't want to use ambient occlusion and I don't want to use sketch and tune. I can see when I switch between them in my render settings, both enabled, but in my making off, they are disabled. However, if I just click on my render settings, you can see it's not active, but it's selected. It shows that it's enabled again. So in here, I can edit and view the settings of the selected render setting, but the renderer will use the one that is chosen on the left. So this is just something that you need to be very careful with. So I usually do not click on the names because I forget sometimes. So I rather only click on these icons here to choose the render setting. So I know the setting that I see here is the one that the renderer will use as well. The effect that I want to use also only exists in the standard renderer. When I click on effect, I want to choose the option that is called higher up, cell renderer. The cell renderer is super simple. It does something similar to sketch and tune, but way more basic. So when I render, I get this. By default, it just creates the outlines of my object. Then I also have the option to create edges. So when I now render, I get this. So that's all it does and can do, nothing else. However, notice how quickly this rendered. I can go to the render settings and I can enable ambient occlusion, and I can render again. You can see it takes as long as it would need to calculate the ambient occlusion, but I don't see it. So here's where it becomes a little bit weird. So apparently it does calculate the ambient occlusion, but the cell renderer does not support it. We can still get it. When I click on multipass, I can see that I can render out a multipass of the ambient occlusion. So this is kind of like our object buffer. We define in the scene what should be in an object buffer, and in the multipass we say render out the object buffer. And here we can say if there's ambient occlusion, render the ambient occlusion as a separate file. So I need to enable the multipass here. In my save option, I would now give this a different name. So maybe I'll call this one Mac Render Making Off. I copy the name and I paste it down here as well. I make sure that the format here as well is PNG and also 16-bit. When I now render this out, you can see it just renders this. It looks like it only renders this, but after it's done, I will see that I get two files. Almost there. I can see how I have this one here that we expected, but I also got this one here, which only includes my ambient occlusion. I could then go into Photoshop and combine these two together, but that is the next step. So first, let's set up these render settings together.
First, can I ask something?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it is when I...
Okay, so we want to have different render settings for the making of version. We open up the render settings and we can see this tiny list down here. We right click on it, we say copy, then we right click underneath it and we say paste. Just like anything else in Cinema, we can rename it by double clicking the name, and we could call this one making of. Close. Make sure it's chosen and selected, and we start to change things. We don't need the sketch and tune, but we know we do want to keep the ambient occlusion. We click on Effect, and we choose the cell renderer. In the cell renderer, we turn on the edges option. If we render this right now, we get something that looks like this. Then we go into the render settings and we need to make sure that the ambient occlusion gets saved into another file. We click on the multipass and we choose the ambient occlusion here. By the way, just adding ambient occlusion as a multipass is not enough if there's no ambient occlusion. So we always need to first have ambient occlusion in here so it renders, and then we say it should also be saved. We click on the multipass checkbox to enable the multipasses overall, and we go to the save option. Here we can now see that we can tell it where it should save the regular image and where it should save the multipass image. Here we can give it a new name, so maybe Mac Render Making Off, and we can use the same name for the multipass image as well. The multipass image, however, should have a different format. By default, it's set to PSD, and in the future, in the next quarter, we want to use it as a PSD. But for today, we keep it simple, and we keep this as a PNG. I think these are all the settings that we want to change. So we can close it and do another render to the picture viewer. All right. By the way, if you're wondering why these strings are so black, The reason is simple. There are just too many polygons. This is very low poly, so there are not so many edges. But when I take a close look at this and I turn on my hidden line option, you can see how this consists of a lot of lines. So the rest does not have so many lines, but this one does, and that is why it becomes so black. If I don't want it to be this black, what I could do is just decrease the amount of lines that I have. I could select the splines, I could change them from adaptive to uniform and decrease the number of segments that they should have. I would do the same for the circle as well. Object, intermediate points should be uniform, and then I decrease the amount. So now when I look at it from further away, it is a little bit easier to see. Okay, then we can open up Photoshop. And we can see what sort of things we might want to do. Let's start with the simplest one, which is the making of. And I think we can do it together because it's so simple. And we've done something similar in the past. We click on Open, and we choose the two making of images. You forgot to enable the edge option. Let me continue. We have both images open, and we want to drag the multipass, so the ambient occlusion image, onto the making of image. We use the Move tool, and we click and drag the image. We drag it. It seems like nothing is happening, but it's still dragging. We drag it onto the tab until it switches. We drag it onto the view. We hold down Shift, then we release the mouse, and it should sit precisely on the other image. Yes, you do. Oh, all right. Then, to combine it, we simply change the blending mode to multiply. If you're a super pro, you can hold down the shortcut Alt-Shift and M, and then the blending mode will switch to multiply. By the way, if you have an image that is rendered and it is a little bit darker and you want to keep for the making of this darker look, you could also use this in sort of an inverted way. Let me show you how. I could double click on the background to unlock it. Then I could create a solid color. Maybe I choose a dark blue, something like this. I could take the dark blue and move it below everything. I take these lines, I drag them to the top, and I set the lines to screen after I invert them. No, just me doing, just to show you how we can also use it in a different way, so we don't always have to stick to the black and white. This is also something that sometimes can look kind of nice and a bit more interesting. Also, super cheap trick, if these lines are not strong enough, you can just duplicate the layer a couple of times. Generally, I would say don't do that, but the alternative, if you don't like this cheat, of course you can create curves or levels, use the clipping mask to apply it just to this layer, and increase the white parts like this. Gives you a pretty similar result, and then it's just a bit more stronger on the background.
Question?
Yeah.
What happened to green today? Yeah.
I don't use green as background colors.
It's me.
Oh,
But yeah.
only rarely. I only used it for the bevel because they had felt nice with the other colors, but generally. All right. Then let's take a look at what we can do with the regular image. Let's open this up in Photoshop. We don't have any object buffers, and I also don't think that we need them. I will do the first steps first, real quick. They are pretty much the same as I always do, because I just found something that works well, so I just always do it. I will start by creating a gradient map. In the gradient map, I will go for black and white. As the black, I will choose a darkish bluish color, something like this. And I could already say, well, this also looks kind of nice. I think this graphic look looks very nice in general. Then I could, double click on this bucket here and give this a little bit more of a warmer color, something like this. Then I set this layer to screen. I duplicate the layer, and I set that layer, I duplicate the layer, and I set that layer to soft light. Then I select the bottom layer, and I change the opacity to something like 50. And now, when we take a look at the before and after, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. Just adds a nicer color contrast to it. We see a more color difference between the background and our shadow, and also on the element. It just doesn't look as flat. Before it looked really flat and the shadows look so grayed out, but with this, they just have overall more color and contrast. Then, just to give it overall a little bit more dynamic, I will create a new gradient. I give it pretty similar colors, so I start with a black and white. Here I choose a more saturated, darker blue color, something like this. And also a bit more saturated orange, but maybe something like this. Then I make this radial a lot larger, like 400, reverse, dither, and drag it to the side, something like this. I drag this underneath my gradient maps, and I set this to soft light as well. So now this is what it's doing. It's just adding a little bit of a light effect to it. So this is what the before was, pretty flat in comparison and grayed out. And the new one just looks a little bit more stylized, with just 3 layers. Let's do those layers together. We start with a gradient map. We click on the icon for the adjustment layers, and we choose the gradient map. Then, with the gradient map selected, we should see in the properties, the gradient. Yours might be black and white, mine is a little bit pale, so we hardly see it. Usually you can double click it, then the properties should open up. Then we click on the gradient, and then we see some presets, and we choose the black and white preset. It's the 3rd one. And then it should look like this. Yeah? Then we double click on the black color, the bottom one, not the top one. The top one is transparency. The bottom one is the color. And here I would choose a medium saturated dark blue color, something like this. Then we double click on the white, and there I want something a bit more saturated. And an orangey yellowish color. Then we hit OK, and it should look something like this. We then use this layer with the blending mode of screen. Then we duplicate it. Either use the shortcut Command J, or if that for whatever reason does not work, you can also drag it onto the new icon. So if I drag it onto the new layers icon, it also creates a duplicate. The top layer, we then want to switch from screen to soft light. The first gradient map, the one that we've set to screen, I think is a little bit too strong, so I would change the opacity to 50%. So it's just a little bit, like just the blacks are not as black, it's just lifted a bit, slightly. Then, maybe my blue color could be a little bit brighter. Then we want to create a gradient. Again, we go to the adjustment layers and we choose a gradient. We click on the gradient preview and we want to change it to black and white. Here we choose pretty similar colors to before. I would make the blue a little bit more saturated than before. And the white should be a little bit less saturated and darker. Like this. Then back in the gradient fill options, we change the style from linear to radial, the scale to something pretty large like 400, and we enable the reverse and the dither option. While this window is open, we can then drag the gradient to the side, something like this. We can hit OK, set the gradient to soft light, and drag it to the bottom. And I think I could have taken much larger colors for the gradient map, brighter colors. But this is pretty much.
What is the blending mode for the gradient?
For the gradient, it would be soft light. Yeah, brighter colors work a lot better. Hmm? Are there any questions concerning this technique? Das ist nicht mein Problem. Alright. So this is the very, very basic stuff that we can do with Sketch and Toon. But there are a lot more things that can be done with Sketch and Toon, because Cinema 4D can not only just create regular lines, it can also use strokes like the art brushes that we know from Illustrator. The difference is that these things are created on its own. So we don't even have to create an art brush. We can just say, make it look like this stroke or that stroke. And each stroke will be different because they are not like an art brush where it's just one image that is stretched along a path, but it's really a generated stroke. I don't have examples prepared, but let's see if we can quickly find something. Cinema 4D, Sketch and Toon. Because there are some pretty cool things that you can create. For instance, stuff like this or like this. So here you can see how it just creates these duotone effects, or not duotone effects. Well, this one is not that special anyways. What about the other one? This one is already a little bit nicer. We can see how it uses some nice patterns to fill in the colors, but it can do more. Yeah, really, these are amateurs. Why are these the first results? Disappointing. Because what Cinema can also create is, yeah, for instance, something like this. And if a 3D program can create something like this, then it's pretty cool. So it creates strokes, and it creates strokes on the same edge multiple times, but it adds randomness to it. So each stroke is a little bit offset from one another. It plays around with overshoots and irregularities. These things are, however, quite tricky to set up. So doing it simple is simple, but the more complex the Sketch and Toon should render, the more complex are the settings that we need to dive into. But in the next quarter, we will take a look at one or two examples where we use something like this here as well, for instance, where it creates these sketch patterns for brightnesses. So it creates these strokes that cross each other, and whenever it should be darker, it just does it more often. So it's a pretty advanced render engine, and many people don't really use the potential of it, unfortunately. But some really cool things can be created with it. All right. Now, this was our last session of Cinema 4D. Next week, we then have our face-to-face, which will be quite regular. In the meantime, of course, you can send me updates of what you're doing. So if you run into issues, I will see how much I can help you out. And next week, when we see each other, we will go one by one. The order, I don't care. I think you can decide on your own who wants to go first. And then you present me your work, show a little bit what you've done. So I want to see the final results, and I might also want to take a look at your Cinema 4D file. Just in case there are already some things where like, all right, so this looks good, and I would like to have this for the exhibition, but there are a few things that I want to change, and then I can directly show you in the Cinema 4D file what I would want you to change. So have both things prepared, the final rendering and the Cinema 4D file. Just the Cinema 4D file does not cut it, because I don't want to sit here and wait for 20 minutes to see a rendering. So finished render, maybe also some Photoshop and After Effects, and the Cinema 4D file. Other questions concerning that? All right. Then, one more thing. Because we had a double session, and you might know that I teach the same class in Hamburg as well, Hamburg kind of has one session more than you guys. That's why I decided whatever the session is that I do with Hamburg next week, which is their last session, is a project that you can decide on. So the class recordings that I do in Hamburg are also online, and because they have the session, or one session more kind of, I would say that you can send me emails with things that you feel like would be great to know as well. So if you want to play around during the break or something, then I will use a project concerning that in the session in Hamburg, and you can watch the class recording, and then you have that content as well. Sounds good?
Yeah.
Nice. Please send me those latest by, when do I have them? On Thursday. By Wednesday. So everything I get until next Wednesday, I can use for that class.
Cool.
Alrighty.
Thanks.
Then, have a nice week, and see you next week.